Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Straz Center's Art and Mind Village Chat. We are so happy to be with you again. This is the fifth in our six-part series about art as a healing modality in cooperation and collaboration with Johns Hopkins University and Susan Mag-Salmon, who is the director of the Art and Mind Lab. Welcome again, Susan. So happy to be doing this together. And we're really, really honored today to have some amazing guests with us. Our conversation today is about literature. It's about word, the spoken word, and the power of the spoken word. And we have some amazing folks with us today who are experts and heart-centered people around the area of the healing power of the word and literature. And I give them an opportunity now to introduce themselves to us. First, we'll start out. Ms. Hannah Drake, welcome to the Village Chat.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Hannah Drake. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I am a writer and spoken word artist.
Jennifer Harmon, welcome to the Village Chat.
Hello, thank you for having me. As Fred said, I'm Jennifer Harmon. I am a former Navy journalist. Went and got my master's in creative writing, and then I started a writing business in the Storytellers Alliance. We work with veterans and at-risk youth and people who just need an outlet and often use writing as a path to healing.
Very good. Dr. David Fakunle, welcome to the Village Chat.
Thank you for having me. Again, I am Dr. David Fakunle. I am a public health researcher, public health practitioner, most importantly, a storyteller. So I have an organization with my mother called Discover Me, Recover Me, where we use the African oral tradition to aid people in their healing, in their recovery from manifestations of trauma, and for encouraging different entities and organizations to utilize storytelling as a part of their practice.
Thank you. Dr. Sybil Johnson, welcome to the Village Chat.
I'm Sybil Johnson, theater professional for many, many years, and a great believer in using the writing, the reading, the expression of self to heal. Very excited to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Mr. John Parks, welcome to the Village Chat.
My name is John Parks, originally from New York City and now living in Tampa, Florida. A choreographer, director, producer. I am the founder of the Parks Institute, dedicated to dance as a healing modality.
John, thank you for being here. And of course, our other co-host, Susan Mag-Salmon. Susan, welcome and take it away.
Well, thanks everybody for being here today. This is really an exciting episode of the program. Story, I think, is perhaps one of the things that connect all of us. We each have our own story. We have a collective story. We have community stories. And so this idea around story and narrative and ultimately thinking about how that translates, whether that is literature, whether it's spoken word, whether we are the creator or the receiver of that language in a way to connect us, I think is just so powerful. I don't think it could be more powerful given the things that are happening around the country and world today, both in terms of health and well-being, but also in terms of social justice. And so I'm very excited to hear each of your voices today. I thought we'd start off by talking, David, with you about this notion around story. I know that you are a storyteller, but I know that you also use story in your work as a public health practitioner to think about how you build community. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I had the great opportunity to really test my personal theory that storytelling needed to be more prominent in public health research during my postdoctoral fellowship at Morgan State University. And with the opportunity to work within neighborhoods in Southwest Baltimore, I decided that instead of kind of continuing the tradition of questionnaires and surveys, I would utilize stories to really understand how those communities and neighborhoods saw their own assets and resources within their immediate neighborhood. And that created story mapping. And story mapping is based on existing literature called qualitative GIS. And as it suggests, it's just simply mapping the stories. So what I did with this process was introduce a story as the facilitator, and that story served as a primer, as a catalyst for the, further discussion to think about what's most important in a person's life. When we think about the things that we need, those material goods, when we think about family and friends, and when we think about our own personal self, our soul, our spirit, that essence of who we are. And that led to the community members and neighborhood residents that I work with creating a map of the places within their immediate neighborhood where those needs were satisfied, and what it meant. What were the values? Uh, what was the importance of these places that they chose to identify as assets and resources that satisfied all of these needs, from again the material needs to the spiritual needs. uh, what I found was it was just a more genuine, natural process by which to acquire this information. One thing that I've learned in my studies as a doctoral student and as a public health researcher is we create way too many boxes for people. And if we know anything about the human experience and the human condition, we aren't confined to boxes. So our responses will not be confined to boxes. And the way that we even ask those questions about the human experience should not be confined to boxes. As a matter of fact, stories, the narratives, the personal expression that every person can provide is exactly what we need to better understand the public in public health.
And Sybil, you've talked about this idea of identity and sharing voice as a way to know yourself and others. Can you talk a little bit about that in some of the work that you've done?
Yes, what comes to mind is a piece that Fred and I collaborated on for the first time at St. Pete JC, when it was JC, now it's St. Pete College, but it's called Rhapsody and Me. And what we did was have each of the students that were involved in the production tell a story that meant something to them from their lives. And we created the piece from their story. So it was from the page to the stage. And that process has been redone and over I've used, and it's very, very therapeutic. It's a very strong way to heal. We talk about, I'd like to dive very deep inside the seed that is me and find my treasure box and break the locks. I'd like to search within the thin spin of sticky web that hides my ebb. And with the surge of evening tide, I'd like to find the place I had the me that should always be outside. And that was sort of our linchpin. And Rhapsody and Me, the story of me, the importance of that we've used with young children to help them develop their self-esteem and help them feel good about whatever it is, whoever they are. And so the whole concept of telling a story, creating it with dance and music, and Fred wrote beautiful lyrics to the songs, and we had excellent, it was just a beautiful experience the first time we did it, and it was so powerful. As I said, that was back in, well, if I say when it was, it might tell how old we are. So let's say, how long ago was that, Fred? maybe in the 80s.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah,
Maybe in the
80s.
80s. Yeah. And so it's a very good tool for getting people to tell their stories. And I've even done it in American Samoa, where I spent about 17 years on and off, where the people speak another language as a first language. And they were able to tell their stories in their language, which was even more powerful for the audience. So I do have a tendency, like John and Fred, they're my buddies, so I do talk a lot too. So just raise your hand like this when it's time for me to be quiet, and I will be quiet. But I just want to say one other thing, that I really, really believe, and I know in my heart, that if it had not been that I was born to be an artist, I probably would not have fared very well with the things that I've gone through, having come through some difficult times, and always able to write about it, laugh about it. When I was living in Fiji, I remember thinking how lonely I was, and I connected the fact that I was sitting in front of Laukala Bay, which is the bay where the college was, and I was from Tampa Bay. And I was able to write a piece that connected Tampa Bay and La Pala Bay. You know, and things like McDonald's French fries taste the same in Tampa as they do in Taiwan. You know, the world is really connected and people are connected. And people, not that that's a healing thing to talk about those French fries. We won't talk about them now. They're not good for you. But that let me see the connection between, you know, the world. How and obviously we know that now with this, what we're dealing with. But yes, that from the page to the stage, the concept of you telling your story, me telling my story through poetry, through stories, narratives, we created a piece that actually moved. And that was exactly the formula that, as I said, I've used many times.
Well, and Sybil, you know, it's interesting that you use French fries as a metaphor because it really works. You know, it's language. Immediately, we all get that.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's a researcher named James Pennebaker who has really spent his life looking at this idea of expressive writing and talks about research that has been done that shows increased mental health, stronger immune systems, better sleep when you're using this kind of expressive work, either as the writer or as the beholder, regulating things like blood pressure, looking at chronic disease and pain. And so we know from a biological perspective that this work does help us absolutely heal. And, you know, everyone's journeys are different, but the struggles that each person has, to have that as a toolbox, I think is extraordinary. Hannah, I'd love to hear about your journey and your work. Would you share a bit with us about how you started writing and some of the work that you've been doing lately?
I think I was just born to write. I think it's just who I am. I tell people all the time, and they may not understand. For me, I can see words in my head and how they're supposed to fit together, like puzzle pieces. It always made sense to me. I always loved reading and I always loved writing. And I never was afforded the opportunity, I guess, with my writing to write about different things. I always wanted to write about social justice for some reason. I just felt compelled to write about what was going on in the world. And so even before everything that we see happening now in the world, this was always what I wrote about. I always wrote about injustice because I felt like I had something to say. Two, I felt like there were many people who maybe could not find the words. And I felt like if I said this, then maybe people would start understanding that I could provide an opportunity for people to have some understanding about race in America. And so lately, it's been, of course, what I've always been doing, but certainly doing more of it in the wake of everything that's happening in our nation. But I think it's important work. It's very important. And when people read a poem or hear a story, we all have stories. And I think that's how you bring people in and allow people to listen. And when I did, I think Fred had mentioned earlier me performing my poem Spaces in front of the Castleman statue where they removed this Confederate statue in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I felt compelled to stand in that space and read this poem, which is about spaces being inclusive or exclusive. And at the time, it was just me and my daughter reading this. She was recording and I'm reading the poem. And people started coming out of their house to hear what I was saying, and they stopped walking and they were really paying attention. And the video has been shared a lot of times, but I told them that what you felt in that moment is what that space can be. So what you heard when I read that poem, think about that you can create a space in this neighborhood that invites everybody in and keeps no one out. And that's the beauty of words. That's the power of what words can do.
That poem, I've shared that piece. I've shared many times. When I first saw it, I just sobbed because it really you let us into your soul and into the pain of your soul to being excluded, and also what it meant to be included.
Yeah.
And we have skin that separates each of us, all of us, from one another, but I felt like I was inside of you. Like and I had not had that experience. And I think you're right. The context of where you were was also very, very powerful. When you shared that poem, how does it feel for you? Like, I know you're performing it, but is it healing for you? Can you talk about the healing nature of sharing that work?
It is healing for me, and then at times can be challenging, but I tell people all the time, and especially as artists or just people, that oftentimes you will have to stand in a space that makes you feel uncomfortable. And that's how the poem came about. I was at a museum and they invited me to perform, a group of artists, and we were all Black and everybody else was white.
Mm-hmm.
And in the audience were two little Black girls watching me perform. So I say this in the poem, but that's actually what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went home that night, because while I was performing, I thought, that's why I'm here. And even though I feel uncomfortable, I'm here because of those little Black girls watching me.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can know that they can stand in this space too. Mm-hmm. So I went home that night and wrote the poem Spaces. Mm-hmm. And it's my most requested poem ever, because everybody at some point, like David, when he spoke about storytelling, has felt they didn't belong somewhere. Mm-hmm. And you know it immediately. Nobody has to tell you this space isn't for you. You can feel it. Mm-hmm. And so there is some healing for me to perform it. There's power for me to perform it in spaces where people typically don't look like me. Mm-hmm. But I think it certainly opens up a door for conversation that extends beyond words, like, oh, that was a nice poem to hear, and then people go home and forget about it. It really opens up a space for people to think about, how are we designing things to include or exclude people?
Yeah. I'm really moved to just, share that. I think for the very first time, and it's kind of a combination of, David, what you shared about giving people the opportunity to tell their story in this realm of public health, and move away from filling out a form that oftentimes is totally irrelevant and can't really, really, really articulate. And Hannah, the power in your Spaces poem, hearing you say that, David, and also remembering how I felt the first time I heard that, there's a lot of conversation about giving voice to the voiceless, or creating an opportunity to really know someone. And these two examples are really, really powerful, as is an extended example of the work that we do with veterans coming back from situations of moral injury and not really being able to articulate that, but oftentimes being able to articulate it more in a poem or just in a few words. Jennifer, share some of the experiences that you've had and some of the connections that you've been able to make through word with our veterans, who also oftentimes are voiceless for many, many, many reasons.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. So in hearing what the previous speakers were saying, I just wanted to comment on, coming from a military journalism background, I always wrote everyone else's story. I told, I told the facts and everything that happened to them. When it came time for me to write about myself, the first thought that came to mind was, who cares? Who cares about my story? But I had to go through my own evolution of that before I could start helping other people. And what I found was through writing, it was healing for me as a person, and as the writer, and as the person who experienced these things. But at the same time, it was so validating the first time I did a public reading, and I had people in the audience that I read the crowd. They were nodding and smiling like, active listeners do, but so many of them approached me afterwards. And even though we didn't have the same experience, we had very similar stories, and that's the universal truth to what we have gone through. And so from there, it kind of, turned a light bulb on for me, to where I said, I had to go through a master's program to have that aha moment. I wanted to bring something to the community. And in doing that, my community is the veteran community. Of course, we extend beyond that, but within the veteran community, it's been amazing to connect with people who, each one of us has a story. We often feel the way that I did, like, who cares about my story? It's mine. Like, but once you start talking about it, and in my case, whether it was going through, a violent trauma, or going through infertility, or going through parenthood, or going through deployment, all of these specific things, I suddenly found myself having conversations with people who were like, oh my gosh, I totally know what you're talking about. So whether it was my experience through Diavolo, where we told a story in movement on the stage, or my experience now working with veterans. We have a veteran writing group that we've just recently stood up, and we're also working on the program within the VA. Every single person that I've worked with doesn't think their story is important. They don't think that their story is worthy. And the moment they tell me their story, I'm like, are you kidding me? This is amazing. Like, and I'm not just blowing smoke. This is something that is so important. Every single one of us has a story inside of us, and especially those who have gone through trauma, whether it was in the military, in combat, or some other form of trauma that we've gone through. It's important to, whether you see it as almost like a diary entry and journaling, but it's important to get that not only out of your body and soul, okay, but to share that, because the relevance to other people may be very surprising.
There's also an interesting opportunity when you tell a story, you're able to organize your narrative, right? And so memory consolidation is so interesting. We bring the world in through lots of different sensory systems, and we hold it in a certain way. But when you reconstitute a memory, whether that's through voice, narrative, or writing, you have you pull that memory up and you can actually resort it. So you can change your narrative, right? And when you hear someone else's narrative, there's a real opportunity to say, oh, that's like me. Or I felt that, but I didn't know what that was. Or that's not me, but this is me, and so this sometimes pushing up against something to find yourself. And I think the value of that allows us to keep growing and changing every time we revisit those stories. And it's like the layers of the onion, how those things get deeper and deeper. I'd love to hear more about the way each of you think about how others can begin to do this work. In our culture, you have to be good at something in order to do it, right? If you're an artist, you have to be a good writer. If you're a painter, you have to be a good painter. There's this idea of quality and skill. How can anybody, I always say that I suck at everything. And so that makes me really good at being a poster child, because I don't think that I'm a good writer or a good artist, but I do it all the time. And that's probably not even the right way to frame it. But John, you teach dance, you talk about dance. Could you talk to us a little bit about, like, how do you get people started who just feel so self-conscious or unclear? Maybe we could just go around the horn and see what people think about. How do you get started?
A lot of what I do is around story. It's hard to get away from story. You put two words together, two movements together, and you have a story. So it's in the eyes of the beholder or the listener. I'm fascinated with I'm not a writer, but I'm fascinated with the spoken word in its many facets. Not only is it audible in terms of a rhythm or a tone when it's spoken, but it's something that is also, when it's written, one can, or when it's spoken, one can write it, and it's remembered in that way. It's analyzed in a way that that sometimes music or dance is not necessarily reflected in that way in terms of a kind of a universal understanding of the words in terms of language and how that manifests in the minds of others, in the recipients. A lot of what I do choreographically and also in terms of my classes sometimes starts with stories, starts with text, and I use their stories and listen to the stories of the dancers, of the students, in order to mold a work around a kind of a universal truth, a universal feeling in terms of how they communicate. It's something that everyone can find some kind of kinship, some kind of relationship with, and connect in some way in the process of the story. As a performer and choreographer, text is also used quite often to carry the story and carry the choreography along, and then kind of connect with it, whether or not it's song in terms of lyrics, whether or not it's text in terms of poetry or prose. Story plays a very integral part in my work, and it also has a way for the dancers and the students to really kind of get inside themselves. Susan, you mentioned, about kind of really hearing Hannah and getting inside of her. Story has and words have a way of kind of doing that in a way that's quite unique.
There's an author, Mary Oliver, the poet Mary Oliver, who talks about the difference between a rock and a stone, and how a rock is such a hard word, but a stone is such a soft word. They mean the same thing, but they don't, right? And Hannah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think about sound when you're writing something. Like, are you sharp? Do you have something that's hard edge versus a soft? And do you think about that? Do you visualize that when you're writing?
I do, because I think as a writer, you think about your audience and what you want them to feel when they hear your work. And so I have a poem that I wrote about Colin Kaepernick, and I wanted it to be harsh. I knew how it was going to sound to the audience, and repeatedly, maybe 20, 30 times in this poem, I used the word boy to refer to Colin Kaepernick. And every time I say it, it hits you hard. But I wanted it to. Mm-hmm. And then I have other poems that have a softer tone to them, because that's what I wanted the audience to experience. But I think as a writer, the journey that you want to take the audience on. Mm-hmm. And you write with that in mind, and then how you will perform it. I've also, when John was just speaking about dance, have worked with the Louisville Ballet here, and partnered with them to write about social justice, and they dance. And during this time, there was only one Black male at the Louisville Ballet. Actually, it's still that way. It's one Black male at the Louisville Ballet who happened to be the choreographer for this piece. So in the piece, he couldn't play my son. I was writing about a mother losing her son. And because he was the choreographer, he couldn't play my son. So they had a ballet dancer portray my son. And I thought, well, how's this going to go over? But it translated well, because the poem was called Ain't I a Mother? And I talked about this mother just losing her child, and everybody in the audience could relate to that. They could understand that. But to see the words paired with the dance took it to an entirely different level, where now we're even doing more work together, because having the two together was phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. I mean, Sybil and David, I'd love your thoughts on this. When someone writes something, like you can read when Hannah reads her work, people can hear the sound. of it. But when you read something, the visual images that you have in your head are completely yours. Our visual references, our perceptions are based on our lived experience, right? So when Hannah talks about the mother and the son and having a white dancer and a black mom, you know, I would think that thinking about the way that we read things and we put our own map on or our own narrative on it really changes, makes the story personal for us. And I guess Sybil and David and Jennifer too, have you seen that in some of the work that you're doing, how people take a story and make it their own, they put their own references to it?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, that is the beauty of storytelling. Storytelling is what you make it. Part of what I do with Discover Me, Recover Me, my mother and I, is uh, encourage our participants to finish stories. And when they finish the story, that gives us direct insight into their perspective on the story. It gives us direct insight into how they perceive the characters, how they perceive the settings, how they perceive the theme, and the overall point of the story. So what I encourage, and to me, the essence of storytelling is that it's yours. Um, we use stories out of the African oral tradition and many other traditions around the world, but we always find ways to make them ours, to make it relevant. So storytelling to me is one of the simplest and again natural and genuine ways to find a person's relevance, their personal relevance. What does it mean to them? Why is it important? Why do we care? The so what? All those questions that we have, especially in the sciences, about the so what is the point, what does this do? The stories give us that context. So I see it as no other way. You know, storytelling is not about memorization. I learned that when I was a little kid. You don't memorize stories, you learn stories. You learn what the point of the story is, and then that allows you to bring your own creativity, your own perspective to it. And that's when you make it yours. So stories are not proprietary. Once a story is out in the atmosphere, it belongs to the world. So when anybody tells that story, it becomes their story. That is how it's supposed to be.
I think it's really interesting too that I think one of the big elements is around the telling of story or a reluctance to tell story is that many of us feel like we're not really being heard. That, you know, that's a big part of it, is that, you know, Jennifer, when you spoke earlier about, you know, what my story doesn't matter, but a lot of it is we, you know, many of us have experienced not feeling like I've not been heard, or that you know, who's going to listen to what I have to say. And many of us protect ourselves from telling our story because we don't want to bare our heart and feel like it falls on deaf ears. One of the approaches, Susan, that you were talking about earlier in terms of introducing people to how do you start this process, what I do is I ask people to tell me their story, and I turn their story into song, because everything that is written has a rhythm, it has a tempo. And when people have that experience, I had a really powerful experience that you made possible, where I had the opportunity to sing a piece of sort of scientific or leadership writing, take something that was written by a neurologist and sing it, you know what I mean? And it reframes it so that the word falls on a different way, the vibration of the sound. And for people, I've had so many instances where people will say, those are my words. John and I just had an experience with an amazing poet that Jennifer recommended to us, which is a part of our program. And I sang the words, and John created choreography. So this kind of thread of understanding that not only are your words important, your words have music, your words have breath, your words express, you know, you, and also it can really help to immediately share your legacy. Sybil, you were talking earlier about the experiences that you had in your life as a young child and how that became a framework for being able to tell story or even live into your artistry. Would you share a little of that?
Right. As I said earlier, I found myself, I looked back at a big group of poems that I wrote years and years ago about my experience growing up in the segregated South, and how in every one of the poems, it was an awful situation, but I turned it into something funny. Even back then, as a young person, I was looking at the good instead of looking at the negative. And it really was a healing activity for me, even now looking back at it and recreating those performances that I had done, had written years ago. I really totally believe in the healing power of writing and storytelling. As people have said, I've dealt with other cultures where I did not speak the language. In Samoa, they speak Samoan. In Taiwan, they speak Chinese. And in both places, I was able to do theater projects that were based on stories that they told. In Samoa, they have a very rich tradition of stories, like traditional stories that come from the different villages. And there's one particular story called The Turtle and the Shark that comes from the village of Waikongi. And everybody from Waikongi tells you that they can go out and sing this particular song and the turtle and the shark will come. And I'm like, oh, that's not real. I can't believe that, And so all of my students would come to me and say, yes, Dr. Johnson, yes, this story is real. It's real. And so they had a connection with the story that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I mean, we're accustomed to fairy tales. And what I had done there also was take the Cinderella story and change it into a Samoan story. Same idea, but it was Lefusina, which means one who sits by the fire, like Cinderella sits by the fire. But it was interesting to see how we were able to translate, even doing Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. We added Samoan to it, and we added some Samoan traditions to it that made it really connect to them. So through story, I've seen not only healing, but understanding of the different cultures. Even in Fiji, the work that I did there and the poetry that I wrote from a position of being very lonely, as I said, looking at the trees and the ocean and looking at the sky, which in the Southern Hemisphere is totally different from the Northern Hemisphere, which, I'm looking for the Big Dipper and I'm like, well, what's wrong with the sky? And I realized, hey, it's a totally different sky. And that must mean, I have a good friend, her favorite thing to say was, oh, that sounds like a poem. And so, these things from life and from our experiences can turn into poetry, can turn into art forms that feed us and excite us. And it's just wonderful. The new, concept here of spoken word, which is not new, but as Hannah knows, it's very old. But everybody thinks it's a new idea, but it's not. It's very old. We've always done that. The griot told everybody's story, and he was so feared that he would get paid to not come tell the story because he had all the dirt. So stories have been formed. Stories have informed our culture. Have really been powerful. And yes, to get people started, because people, like you say, the first thing you think of is, oh, my story's not all that. Who am I? Whatever. In theater, we start out with that period because we have to empower each individual to believe in who they are and how important they are to the situation. When I walked into the classroom and said, okay, kids, we're doing Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, they all looked at me like, yeah, she really is crazy. Number one, she's way over here in the middle of the ocean with us and talking about Shakespeare. Who the heck is that? I kind of know, but at the end of that time, we had not only accomplished the academic aspect, but we also had allowed them to put their thumbprint on the production, which made it more powerful for them. And so yes, story, there's great power in story and great power in allowing a person to evolve in the space of time that you create for performance. Like John is talking about using story. We've for many years done a poem and the music and the dance, the three things together, the power of that. And even visual art has been incorporated with the poetry, the dance, and the music.
Very
Yeah,
good.
I just want to add, I think that in this time, and it's always relevant, but in this time of social justice, the sense of history and the sense of really reaching back and remembering and those stories and those events. David, you talk about location and just to identify location and time and stories within this particular time. I think it has a particular and a specific relevance in terms of holding on to that. We have to know where we came from. We have to know our history. We have to know who whose feet we're stepping on, who's supporting us, where's our roots. And those come out of stories, those come out of your remembrances. And I think it's very, very important for that to kind of sense be kind of carried on and increase, just in terms of stories, in terms of vision, just in stories in terms of what's your next step, what's the next thing that you're going to do, where's your imagination. I mean, those all come out and are expressed through stories. So I think it's very, very important in terms of, you know, in terms of reparation. And I don't mean necessarily financial reparation. I mean just getting back with something that you possess, or something that you would like to have, or, you know. So I think this is a very, very strong discussion in terms of continuum of relationship to stories.
John, you make me think about how history is told by the people in power, right? The power of story is about power. And for me, over the last, 6 months or so now, I'm hearing stories I've never heard before. And I'm really grateful for that, because that in knowing that the stories that I was told, the stories that were in the books, they're a story, but they're not the only story. And I feel like story, in how we rewrite narrative and we think about the future, it's really important to know that there are many, many stories that have never been told, that need to be told and just need to be heard. And I feel like Hopkins is doing a series right now on social justice, and Elijah Cummings' widow spoke to us yesterday, and in her own right is doing some really interesting work. And she told stories about her life that hadn't been told before, and to have all of these folks be able to hear that, to hear new stories, I think is really healing in its own way. So you just brought that up for me.
No, I agree with the importance of the stories that history can share with us. You know, I've been getting a lot of opportunities to talk about history, particularly as it relates to the movement that's happening in this current time. And as someone that grew up in a Black History Museum, the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum, a place that shaped who I am and shaped my knowledge and understanding of the African diaspora and what it means to be an African born in America, it's important for me, being an adult now, being someone who has the opportunity to share this information with youth, to remind them of the people behind these movements and the people who did these incredible things. So I think about, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was young. He was human. He didn't have everything figured out, but look at the incredible things that he did. I think about Fred Hampton, leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago. He was only 21 when he was assassinated. He was young, but he had so many things figured out, and so much more to figure out, but unfortunately didn't have the chance. So for me, history shows how, despite the incredible things that people accomplished, the legacies that they leave, they were human all along. They had the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same questions, the same confusions, anxieties, all those things that we feel are exclusive to us. But as we tell our story, as we share our truth, we realize that there are so many commonalities that we share. And to me, now more than ever, it's important for young people, the youth, to know that as you are making these revolutionary changes, as you are engaging in these revolutionary acts, you'll be human the whole time. You won't have everything figured out. You'll have your anxiety, you'll have your misunderstandings, you'll have your fear, and that's okay. That's what makes us human, and that is what we need now more than ever, that humanity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. Absolutely. It's all a conversation about really reaching back and finding and really articulating our humanity. So the thread of the tapestry of this amazing conversation could go on and on and on, but unfortunately it can't. So sadly, I bring this to an end for now, and really, really thank Hannah And thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Dr. David. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Sybil. And as always, thank you, Susan, for leading us through this conversation. I hope that people will be inspired to even just write down a sentence, write down a word, write down a thought. That's the beginning. And to the degree that we're able to share our stories, then we can more deeply understand each other and move towards a communal healing. And this really recognizing and articulating our humanity, as you so eloquently stated, David. So thank you all, and thanks to everyone for sharing your most valuable commodity, and that's your time. Again, always thankful to Johns Hopkins University for our collaboration here with us at the Straz Center. Our next Art and Mind Village will be sort of a coming together of the five art disciplines that we've spoken about, and we'll continue a conversation about where do we go from here. I'm Fred Johnson, representing the Straz Center. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time, stay strong, stay well, be happy. Take care. Thank you all so very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.